Hey everyone, welcome back to the deep dive. We're diving into something pretty fundamental today, something that's really at the core of how we understand a massive collection of ancient texts,
Yeah,
the Bible.
absolutely.
You're here because you love to get smart and you love to do it quickly.
That's right.
And today we are talking about a topic that's super relevant to how we read and understand these texts. We're going to be focusing specifically on how a single Hebrew word that's linked to the idea of slavery has been translated over time
Yeah, it's really
and
fascinating.
how that impacts how we
Ah,
read these texts today.
it definitely does.
So joining me today is Expert Name. He's an expert on biblical translations, ancient languages, and all that good stuff.
Well, I wouldn't say all that good stuff, but I'm happy to be here.
So to get us started, we've got this excerpt from Peter J. Williams' book, Slaves in Biblical Narrative and in Translation. So for everyone listening, if you want to check that out, um, he dives deep into the Hebrew word, ebed, that's spelled een bet dalet, which is usually translated as servant, work, or dependence.
Right. And it's not as simple as just picking one of those words.
Yeah.
It's more nuanced than that. It speaks to a relationship, a state of being under someone else's authority.
Right.
And what we'll see is that how this word has been translated has changed a lot over the centuries. And it's important because this word is all over those important stories, like the Exodus.
Yeah, and that's what's really interesting about this, right? You think about the Exodus and the idea of slavery.
Right.
It's kind of a central theme there.
Exactly. And what's surprising is that the word slave itself is almost completely absent in early English translations of the Bible.
Yeah.
The ones that many people still read today.
Yeah, like the King James Version.
That's the one.
And the KJV.
She's like, where is the word slave?
Right. You'd think it'd be all over the place, but it's not. It's almost like a ghost word in those early translations. Yeah, it's kind of spooky. So our mission today
That's spooky.
is to figure out, what happened?
Yeah.
Why this change? And what does it mean for how you and I are reading these texts today?
It's a real deep dive, and it might change the way you think about these stories.
Okay, so let's talk about this absence of slave in those early translations. So Williams points out that the KJV, the
Yeah.
King James Version, which came out way back in 1611,
1611, yeah.
only uses the word slave once in the entire Old Testament.
Can you believe that?
One time.
Just once.
It's crazy.
Out of all those chapters and verses.
It's in Jeremiah.
Jeremiah 2.14.
Yeah, 2.14. And it's this really interesting verse. It says, is Israel a servant? Is he a homeborn slave? But here's the thing.
Here's the catch.
It's not even a direct translation of Yebe.
Right, it's not. They're using slave as another way to say homeborn in this kind of poetic parallel structure.
So they're not even translating it directly from the Hebrew.
Nope. And, in the original printing of the KJV, slave was actually in smaller letters there to show it wasn't directly linked to a specific Hebrew word.
So they were trying to be super precise.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They knew there was a difference.
So for hundreds of years, English readers were reading the Old Testament without ever really encountering this word slave.
It's mind-boggling when you think
It's
about it.
crazy, right?
And it gets even weirder.
Wow.
Because then you have the revised version, the RV, which came out in 1885.
Okay.
They added 2 more uses of slave,
Okay.
Deuteronomy 21.14 and 24.7, both dealing with selling people. But even then, they didn't translate Ebed directly. They went with to deal with someone as a slave.
So they were still kind of dancing around it.
Yeah, still tiptoeing. And the American Standard Version, which came a bit later in 1901, they stuck with just those 3 uses of slave as well.
So still a pretty limited use of the word slave.
Very limited. And, that's pretty interesting considering what was going on in the world at that time.
Yeah, slavery was a huge issue.
Huge. The 19th century saw massive debates about slavery, abolition movements, and, of course, the American Civil War.
You'd think that would make those older translations more likely to use slave, but it seems like the opposite happened.
You would think so, wouldn't you? But Williams suggests that it might have been the opposite. Those translators were trying to be so faithful to the original KJV
Right.
that they were hesitant to make big changes.
They were sticking to the script.
Exactly.
Okay, so fast forward to the 20th century,
But things change.
and all of a sudden, slave appears everywhere.
It explodes onto the scene.
It's like, bam, there it is.
Yeah, it's a real shift. The Revised Standard Version in 1952 used slave 100 times in the Old Testament.
Wow.
Big jump. Then the New Revised Standard Version in 1989 bumped that up to 142.
142.
The New International Version in 1984 had 104. Even the New King James Version, which was trying to stay close to the original KJV, had 42 instances of slave.
It's like a tidal wave of slave.
It is. And the Jewish Publication Society's 1985 revision went all the way up to 122.
So what happened? What's the deal with this massive increase in slaves?
That's the million-dollar question?
Williams actually asked a really good question.
Yeah.
Was the 20th century actually more sensitive to the issues of slavery than the 19th century? Because, like we were talking about, the 19th century had all this debate around slavery.
It did, and yet those earlier translations didn't use slave very much at all. So it might not be about sensitivity, but more about a change in translation philosophy. Maybe translators in the 20th century felt more free to move away from the KJV's language and make their own choices about how to render Ebed.
So a bit more freedom in translation.
More freedom.
Okay, so slave makes this big comeback. But even with all these new instances, servant is still the more common translation for Ebed in modern Bibles.
You see both slave and servant, even though it's the same Hebrew word.
So are translators just choosing which English word they like best?
Yeah.
Flipping a coin or something?
Well, not exactly. It seems like they're looking at the context, you know?
Okay.
They're trying to decide if a particular instance of Ebed sounds more negative or neutral to them. Like if the situation seems oppressive, they might go with slave. If it's more general service or a less harsh situation, they'll choose servant. But it's all coming from the same Hebrew word underneath.
That's really interesting because that means that there's a lot of human interpretation going on.
Oh, absolutely. There's no way around it. Every translation is an interpretation.
Yeah.
And those choices can really impact how you understand the text.
Okay, so give me an example of this, like negative versus neutral thing.
Sure. Let's take Isaiah 52.13. It's the beginning of what's called the servant song. You won't find many translations calling it the slave song.
Right.
Even though the figure in the song is treated really badly. It's a powerful and moving passage.
Yeah.
But translators tend to use servant in that context.
Interesting.
Another example is Joshua 1.13. It says, your servant Moses. You hardly ever see your slave Moses.
Huh. It's always servant in that case.
Almost always.
So even though it's the same Hebrew word, translators are making choices based on how they perceive the situation.
Precisely. And this isn't a new thing either. This idea of using different words for the same Hebrew term goes all the way back to the Septuagint, which was the early Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they had a bunch of different Greek words they used for Ibed, like doulos, therapon, and oikitas.
So even back then, they were grappling with how to capture the nuances of this word.
Exactly. And you know, what's really fascinating is that doulos, which is often the closest Greek word to our understanding of slave, wasn't used very much in the earliest books of the Bible in Greek.
Oh, really?
But its use increased in later Greek versions like the Vamvas Bible.
Huh. So even within the Greek translations, there's a shift happening.
There is a definite shift, yeah.
So we've got all this variation in translation. But what does Williams actually say about the meaning of this word, Ebed?
He argues that the core meaning of Ibed is relational. It indicates dependence or being under someone's authority.
Okay.
It's about the connection, the relationship, but it doesn't inherently carry a negative connotation.
So it doesn't automatically mean oppression or suffering?
Not necessarily, no. It could involve those things, but the word itself doesn't equal those things.
Okay, that's a really important distinction.
It is.
So it's not about being mistreated or having no rights. It's more about having a position of being under someone's authority, whether that's a human or even God.
Exactly. And this connects directly to the Exodus story, doesn't it?
Yeah.
You see, the Israelites' departure from Egypt isn't just about running away from this inherently awful state that our modern word slave implies. It's
Yeah.
about leaving one form of service to enter another to serve God.
Oh, wow.
That's a powerful shift in perspective, isn't it?
Yeah, that really changes things.
The Hebrew verb abad, which is related to ebed, is used repeatedly in the book of Exodus to describe the Israelites' intended service to God. Even their remembering of the Exodus is described as their service.
So the act of leaving Egypt is all about entering into a different kind of relationship, a different kind of service.
Precisely. And this makes you think differently about all the other uses of Ebed throughout the Bible.
Yeah, like it challenges our assumptions about what the word means.
It does.
So what about the curse on Canaan in Genesis 9.25? That passage is often brought up in discussions about slavery.
Right, where it says, a servant of servants shall he be. It sounds like a very harsh form of servitude. But even there, the Septuagint, that early Greek translation, uses words that are found in other, less negative contexts.
Huh. So even in that extreme case, The translation isn't clear-cut.
It's not. And, Williams points out that Ebed even shows up on ancient seals. These seals were like signatures, and they indicated that the person who owned the seal was under someone else's authority.
Okay.
But that didn't necessarily mean it was a bad thing. It was just a fact of their social structure.
Okay, so having that seal didn't automatically mean they were being oppressed.
Not at all.
That's fascinating. And Abraham even calls himself your servant in Genesis 18.3, even though he's not really subordinate to the person he's talking to at that moment.
Right. It's a way of showing respect, acknowledging a power dynamic, but not necessarily actual subjugation.
So it seems like Ebed was a much more flexible term than our modern word slave.
Much more.
It had a wider range of meanings and wasn't always negative.
Exactly. Which is why just using slave as the translation can be problematic.
Yeah, especially considering all the baggage that comes with the word slave for us today.
Oh, absolutely. When we hear slave, we immediately think of the transatlantic slave trade, the Roman Empire, these brutal systems of oppression. And those are valid and important associations.
Of course.
But ancient Israel was a different society with different social structures and understandings of servitude.
So imposing our modern understanding of slave onto the biblical text can be really misleading,
It can distort the meaning, yeah.
because some of the laws in the Bible do describe situations that we would consider slavery today, right?
Yes, they do. But the Hebrew word ebed itself doesn't automatically convey that same level of brutality and exploitation that we associate with the word slave.
So by consistently translating Ebed as slave, we might miss the nuances, the complexity of the original word.
We might impose a rigid dichotomy between slave and free that wasn't always present in the biblical text.
And by using both slave and servant, we create this artificial distinction, this separation between these two ideas, when in reality, it was all part of this broader spectrum of dependence and service.
Exactly. We lose sight of the underlying connection.
Okay, so if slave isn't always the best translation, what about servant?
Williams makes a good case for servant. He argues that it's a more flexible word in English.
Okay.
It can encompass a wider range of meanings, which might better reflect the way ebed was used.
So servant has a bit more wiggle room.
It does.
It can accommodate those different shades of meaning.
Yeah, and some people might feel uncomfortable using servant to describe someone who is in a situation that we would call slavery today.
Right, it might feel too soft, too gentle.
Exactly. But Williams points out that just because a word is used to describe a particular social category, it doesn't mean that the word only means that.
So give me an example.
Sure, think about the word king. It can refer to a powerful, absolute ruler, or it can refer to a king who's just a figurehead with no real power. But the word king itself doesn't automatically mean powerless.
Oh, I see.
The same goes for servant. Just because it can be used to describe someone in a situation we might consider slavery doesn't mean that the word itself is inherently devoid of the potential for harshness or exploitation.
That's a really helpful way to think about it.
And, there's evidence from other ancient Near Eastern languages that supports this idea. Sumerian, Akkadian, they all had words that were similar to ebed, and those words could refer to a wide range of social positions and relationships, from general workers to people in very privileged positions. And even scholars who study those societies debate about which social groups should actually be labeled as slaves.
So it's not as clear-cut as we might assume.
Not at all.
So servant might be a better fit because it reflects the ambiguity, the flexibility of the original Hebrew.
Exactly. It helps us avoid imposing our very specific and very negative understanding of slave onto a word that really had a much broader scope.
And it avoids creating this hard line between slave and free,
Yeah.
when that wasn't always the primary focus in the biblical text.
It's about recognizing the complexity, the spectrum of human experience.
So to wrap this all up for our listeners, what are the key takeaways from this deep dive into Ebed?
Well, first, the fact that slave appears so much more frequently in modern Bibles is a significant change from those earlier translations.
Yeah, it's a huge shift.
But it doesn't necessarily mean that the original Hebrew word was inherently negative in the way our English word is today.
Right. So we shouldn't assume that every time we see slave in a modern translation, it means the same thing as our modern understanding of slavery.
Exactly. Ebed is primarily about relationship dependence, being under someone else's authority. It covers a wide range of experiences, from serving God to various forms of human servitude.
So the inconsistency in translation, while maybe trying to capture different shades of meaning, could actually make it harder for us to see the underlying unity of the term.
It might obscure the fact that the same basic idea is at play in all these different situations.
This leaves us with a lot to think about, doesn't it? Like, does this increased use of slave in modern translations affect how we read and understand those biblical narratives, especially the Exodus? Does it make us focus on oppression and suffering as the central theme, when maybe the original Hebrew was pointing to a broader idea of service and dependence, even in the midst of difficulty?
It's a question worth pondering for sure.
Yeah, it's a real challenge to our assumptions, and that's what we love to do here at the Deep Dive, right?
That's what it's all about.
Challenge those assumptions, make you think a little bit deeper.
Dig a little deeper, uncover those hidden layers of meaning.
So, thanks for taking this deep dive with us, everyone. And until next time, keep digging.
Keep exploring.